And then we also have that phrase, kill your darlings, which is used in writing. And so here, like, he has to literally kill his darlings in order to prove that he is a writer. So this movie is not a direct adaptation, of course, because one, the book has no plot. But also, I don't know why anyone would want a direct adaptation of this book, because so much of what we read is just so disturbing and gross, and I am baffled as to why anyone would want to see some of these things portrayed on screen. But anyway. Hello and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I'm talking about Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs, published in 1959, and I'm comparing it with the movie directed by David Cronenberg, which was released in 1991. So before reading this book and watching this movie, I thought I knew what I was getting myself into, because I've heard a lot about this movie. I'm familiar. Cronenberg, he has a reputation. I've seen The Fly and other movies of his, and I had seen images from this movie, and I also had heard things about the book. Plus, I read one of William Burroughs' books last year, and so I thought I was prepared, and I knew that this would be disturbing and gross, but I was like, you know what? I'm ready. Let's do it. And I read the book first, and I was not prepared for this book. The level of gross, upsetting content that I thought I was prepared for, I should have multiplied that times 10, and then maybe I would have been fully prepared. And then also last year, I read Queer by William S. Burroughs, and I saw the movie by Luca Guadagnino. The movie is fantastic. Guadagnino is such an incredible director. But also that, I'm glad I have the background of having read that book, but thinking I was prepared for Naked Lunch because I read Queer, no. Naked Lunch is doing something else entirely. It's on its whole own plane of existence, and reading Queer didn't really prepare me for Naked Lunch. And I have decided that I never want to read anything else Burroughs wrote when he was under the influence of drugs. I'm down to read stuff he wrote in his more sober times. But yeah, anything he wrote on drugs, I have zero interest in ever reading anything like this again. And I know fans of Burroughs won't like me boiling this book down to just being a very gross, very sad book, but that's basically the gist of it. That's not just the gist of it, because as we get in this video, you will hear me try to make more sense of it and, quoting other people and sharing interpretations. So I am attempting to understand it better. But yeah, at the end of the day, my brain was just rejecting so much of what I was taking in as a self-defense mechanism, because my brain and body knew, if you fully process what you are reading right now, it will be seared in your brain for the rest of your life, and you do not need these mental images in your head forever. And so before I could even fully take in and process what I was reading, my brain and body was just nope, kicking it right back out. We are not gonna let this seep into your psyche. So, it was really something. But reading this book, though, did prepare me for the movie, because the movie honestly wasn't that bad in a weird, gross, disturbing kind of way, because compared to the book, the movie, yeah, it wasn't that bad. Honestly, for most of it, I was kind of surprised how undisturbed I was. However, around the 90-minute mark, there was a scene that I did find incredibly disturbing. We will get to it. But yeah, up until then, I was yeah, it's weird, but it wasn't as bad as the book was. But I am, like I said, I am really glad I read Queer beforehand, because Cronenberg, he took things from the book Naked Lunch, the book Queer, Burroughs' own personal life, and he probably took things from Burroughs' book Junkie as well, but I haven't read that. And so yeah, he took things from all of those for the movie Naked Lunch. And the monologue from Queer, where he talks about realizing the first time he realized he was a homosexual, and how the story of the person named Bobo talking to him, all of that is from Queer, and yet we have him deliver that monologue here in Naked Lunch. And so it was interesting to hear him say this line in this movie in comparison with Daniel Craig's delivery of this same line in queer. And by the way, when it comes to David Cronenberg, I have talked about him like 1.5 times before on my channel because I covered The Dead Zone, which he directed, that as a Stephen King adaptation. And then also I mentioned his movie The Fly in my video where I talk about The Fly. Most of that video, I'm talking about the Vincent Price movie, but I do briefly mention the Cronenberg movie. But The Fly, I think, is way more disgusting than Naked Lunch. Like, that movie made me feel nauseous. And so I feel like as far as disgusting movies go, I think The Fly was so much more disgusting than Naked Lunch personally. But now I want to get into more details on the book and just talk about the book a bit more. So this isn't going to be spoilers though, because for one, I feel like you can't really spoil this book because there is no plot, but also I'm not going to be talking about like the nitty-gritty details either. So you can hear everything I have to say about the book and still go read it for yourself, and plenty of it will come as a surprise, you know? So I will get maybe a bit more into the details when we're getting into the movie. But William S. Burroughs has attributed Jack Kerouac, his writing friend, as naming this book, and he says of this, "Most survivors do not remember the delirium in detail," meaning being on heroin. "I apparently took detailed notes on sickness and delirium. I have no precise memory of writing the notes, which have now been published under the title Naked Lunch. The title was suggested by Jack Kerouac. I did not understand what the title meant until my recent recovery. The title means exactly what the words say. Naked lunch, a frozen moment when everyone sees what is on the end of every fork." But while this book can be incredibly gross, like I've said, it can also just be hard to follow. And I want to share a quote, and this line right here, it is intentionally convoluted, but I'm still going to share this quote in particular for you to get a feel of what the writing is like sometimes. "What are you thinking?" said the squirming American tourist, to which I reply, "Morphine having depressed my hypothalamus, seat of libido and emotion, and since the front brain acts only at second hand with the back brain titillation, being a vicarious type citizen can only get his kicks from behind, I must report virtual absence of cerebral event. I am aware of your presence, but since it has for me no effective connotation, my effect having been disconnected by the junk man for the non-payment, I am interested in your doings. Go or come, shitter F yourself, with a rasp or an asp, 'tis well done and fitting for a queen, but the dead and the junkie don't care." And then, like I said, this book has no plot, like there is no narrative going on here. And Burroughs writes, "There is only one thing a writer can write about, what is in front of his senses at the moment of writing. I am a recording instrument. I do not presume to impose story, plot, continuity. Insofar as I succeed in direct recording of certain areas of psychic process, I may have limited function. I am not an entertainer. You can cut into Naked Lunch at any intersection point. I have written many prefaces. They atrophy and amputate spontaneous." And then the book I read came with multiple afterwords written by different people, and one of them was written by a book editor named David Ulin, who is a big William S. Burroughs fan, and he even met Burroughs. And he talks about the lack of narrative structure at the end of this book, and so I want to share what he said. "I could not read the book when I was younger because I was expecting it to work on a level I understood. I was expecting it to follow a progression, when instead, the whole point is that there is no progression. October 1959, 3 months after the novel's publication, Burroughs discovered a strategy to go further in that direction, stumbling, with his friend and collaborator Brian Geeson, across the cut-up method in which pieces of text are cut apart and reconnected, unlocking whole new meanings and possibilities. This is a key Burroughs concept, because it undercuts the control system of narrative, opening a space for randomness and accident while disrupting the primacy of word. There's no way to read Burroughs' great cut-up trilogy of the 1960s without giving up any sense of narrative agency, but among the triumphs of Naked Lunch is that it achieves a similar effect by relying solely on the imaginative force of Burroughs' mind. And where are we without narrative? What happens when even the instinct to tell stories, a human imperative, is revealed as a construction of a kind? This is the power of the contradiction of Burroughs' writing, of an author who wanted to rub out the word. That's the beauty of the book, as well as its enduring complication, not to give shape to the chaos, but merely to present it, in all its clarity and terror, in so doing to tell us something of what it means to live as we do. And so initially, when I was reading this, I kind of wanted to write it off as just like weird, nonsensical rambling, not totally nonsensical, but like just these weird ramblings by someone who is high on drugs, because as I quoted earlier, Burroughs, he doesn't even remember writing a lot of this book. But he was more sober when he edited the book and put it together with the help of others. And so, there is a reason behind these stories and the way they're told and the lack of structure. And so there is a purpose behind it. There are, devoted Burroughs fans who have studied more the details and the intricacies and the purpose behind it, kind of like this guy right here. And so that does help me appreciate the writing style a bit more than I otherwise would have. And then also the edition I read came with an afterword written by Burroughs. It was written in 1960, so the following year. And he talks extensively about the writing, the putting together of this book. And he also talks a lot about his drug addiction and his recovery. He was on drugs off and on throughout his life. But yeah, I really appreciated this part. And I found this part really interesting. And again, throughout reading Naked Lunch, I wrote off Burroughs and I was like, I'm never reading anything he wrote ever again. But then this section, which he wrote when he was more sober, I really liked. And so this part made me come around again to where okay, I will read more by him if it's when he's more sober. And I also want to share a quote from this section that he wrote where he talks about how people find this book so disgusting, right? And he says, "Since Naked Lunch treats this health problem, meaning the heroin problem, it is necessarily brutal, obscene, and disgusting. Sickness is often repulsive details not for weak stomachs. Certain passages in the book that have been called pornographic were written as a tract against capital punishment in a manner of Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal. These sections are intended to reveal capital punishment as the obscene, barbaric, and disgusting anachronism that it is. As always, the lunch is naked. If civilized countries want to return to druid hanging rites in the sacred grove or to drink blood with the Aztecs and feed their gods with blood of human sacrifice, let them see what they actually eat and drink. Let them see what is on the end of that long newspaper spoon." And so again, hearing him himself talk about what his purposes were with it, it did make me appreciate it a bit more. But at the end of the day, I just hated reading this book. The experience of reading it was one of the worst reading experiences I've ever had. And so even though on a certain level I can appreciate it, it is not one I would recommend to the general public. But despite the book's lack of plot and structure, there are some reoccurring characters that happen throughout, because each story, by the way, each chapter is its own short story, short essay. And so there's some reoccurring characters that pop up throughout the book. And then there's reoccurring themes for sure. There's a lot of stories that deal with drug addiction. Most of them deal with real life drugs, primarily junk, since that is what he was on. But he also sometimes will make up drugs as well. And then a lot of the stories also relate to sex in one way or another. And a lot of the sexual content was relating to either sexual perversions or sexual torture or rape or just really upsetting, disturbing things that were difficult to read. But hearing how so much of this book, basically the whole book really, in one way or another, is about drugs, either directly or indirectly, it's about drug addiction. And this is one of the things that I just found so sad about this book. And it made me think there's a slogan in AA where they say that once you get sober, your world gets big. Because when you're addicted to a substance, you have tunnel vision and all you care about is the thing you're addicted to. And so while reading this book, you can tell that Burroughs had a very small world due to being under the influence and being hooked on this drug. And yeah, it was just really depressing. And one section relating to drugs, we read, "Running out of veins and out of money. Keep going on the nod. Last night I woke up with someone squeezing my hand. It was my other hand. Fell asleep reading, and the words take on code significance. Obsessed with codes. Man contracts a series of diseases which spell out code messages. Take a shot in front of DL. Probing for a vein in my dirty bare foot. Junkies have no shame. They are impervious to the repugnance of others. It is doubtful if shame can exist in the absence of sexual libido. The junkie's shame disappears with his non-sexual sociability, which is also dependent on libido. The addict regards his body impersonally as an instrument to absorb the medium in which he lives. Evaluates his tissue with the cold hands of a horse trader. No use trying to hit there. Dead fish eyes flick over a ravaged vein." And then a lot of sections about this book also deal with being gay, and that also was just really difficult to read because obviously this was written in the 1950s and William Burroughs was gay, but he lived in a world that viewed being gay as a sickness and something, that was so abhorrent and something was wrong with you. And to be a gay, queer person living in a time when that's how people viewed you, how that must have seeped into who he was, right? And Yeah, it's I don't know, it's just really sad, right? To think of queer people living at that time and how they were viewed. And of course, he explores this a lot in the book Queer. And then here we get it too with some of the different routines that we get throughout this book and just how gay people were viewed by others, by society. And there is one story kind of near the end that I really liked. And this is one of the ones that wasn't like graphically disturbing, but it was still sad and upsetting because it is about a man who was brought in for questioning because it is speculated that he has had homosexual relations. And so they have him do these different tests so that he can prove that he's actually attracted to women. And it almost came across like gay conversion therapy, right, to a certain extent. But yeah, this was just a really sad but well-written segment. And before I move on to the movie, I now want to talk about Burroughs' own life because that does contribute to the movie. So I did talk about this in my video for Queer, but I'm going to go over it again here. But most people, most readers, even if you're not a fan of Burroughs, most readers know that he accidentally shot his wife, Joan Vollmer, when they were doing a William Tell trick. And so the story goes, there's like different versions of what happened, but the most well-known version is that they were under the influence and they were hanging out with other people. And Burroughs says to her, like, oh, time for our William Tell act. And so she puts a glass on her head and he's trying to shoot the glass, but he misses and instead he shoots and kills her. And yeah, her death, of course, impacted him greatly. And he has said that he would not have started writing as much as he did and his career would not have taken off like it did had it not been for her death. And so because his writing was so tied to her death and the fact that he caused her death, it gave him very complicated feelings about his writing. And then also he was close friends with Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, and they are some of the members of the Beat generation of writers. And Kerouac and Ginsberg also helped him put together what became Naked Lunch. And again, Kerouac is the one who came up with the title. And Kerouac also said that working on this book with Burroughs gave him night terrors, which I totally understand. That makes complete sense. But to move on to the movie now. So this movie is not a direct adaptation, of course, because one, the book has no plot. So how could this be a direct adaptation? But also, I don't know why anyone would want a direct adaptation of this book because so much of what we read is just so disturbing and gross, and I am baffled as to why anyone would want to see some of these things portrayed on screen. But anyway, because this book really was impossible to adapt, what Cronenberg did was he took certain aspects and certain themes from Naked Lunch and he combined it with Burroughs' own life and some of his other works. And so I think Cronenberg did a great job of just paying homage to William Burroughs and his works while making this movie. And so I'm going to go over the basic gist of the plot. If you have seen this movie and you already know what happens, you can use the chapters down below to skip ahead to the next part. But our main character is Lee. He is a bug exterminator. By the way, Burroughs himself was an exterminator, I think when he lived in New York. So this was a job he himself had. And being an exterminator does come up at least once in Naked Lunch, the book. But anyway, so our main character, Lee, he is a bug exterminator, but the bug powder he uses can be used as a drug, and his wife is hooked on it, and she therefore is using up all of his bug powder, preventing him from doing his job, and she encourages him to try some himself, and so he starts using it as well. And he then begins to hallucinate seeing giant beetles that are undercover agents and are giving him a mission to fulfill. And on one hand, he knows he is hallucinating, and yet at the same time, he also has a hard time not believing it. So it's this weird place, which I actually kind of liked, and that felt kind of accurate to drugs, where on one hand, you know it's not real, and yet it seems so real. But this first big bug tells him that Joan, his wife, is an inhuman undercover agent and that he needs to kill her. And he then sees Dr. Benway, who gives him black centipede powder that Benway says can cure Lee of his addiction to the bug powder. It can cure he and his wife. And he then comes home to see Joan having sex with one of his writer friends while the other writer friend is reading, and they're on the bug powder. And he then gets high on the bug powder, and then while they are there with the friend, he tells her it is time for their William Tell trick, and she puts a glass on her head and he shoots and misses and kills her. He then meets a mugwump at a bar, and a mugwump is just a weird looking creature. And this mugwump tells him that he needs to buy a typewriter, move to a place called Interzone and write about his wife's death. And so while he is in Interzone, when he types into this typewriter, it turns into one of those giant beetles. And so when it turns into the giant beetle, it tells him like, oh, you did a good job killing Joan, because again, she was like an inhuman undercover agent, and now you are going to be an agent for us. And it tells him that pretending to be a homosexual is the best cover a person can have. And the beetle tells him to type this, and as Burroughs types this into the beetle seems to be getting like sexual pleasure from this. But then while out and about in Interzone, he meets a couple named Tom and Joan. And Joan not only has the same name as his dead wife, but she also looks like her too. And Tom lets Bill borrow Tom's own fancy typewriter, and in the night, Bill awakes to see his bug typewriter killing Tom's bug typewriter. And he is then told by his bug typewriter that he needs to seduce Joan. So he goes to see her, and the way he seduces her is by having her type sexual things on Tom's Arabic typewriter, which then morphs into like this part human, part creature thing, and the three of them are doing sexual things together. Before then, their maid, their like housekeeper, comes in and she puts a stop to it, and she also like whips the typewriter creature thing, and she gets it to jump off the balcony, and once it jumps off the balcony, it turns into a regular broken typewriter. And Joan later says that she needs to make penance for what she did, and so she goes to be with her housekeeper, who also happens to be the leader of some cult. And Tom, her husband, then comes in and tells Bill that he wants his other typewriter back. And so he later goes to Bill's place, and since Bill no longer has Tom's typewriter, because remember, Bill's typewriter destroyed Tom's, which he later acknowledges. He knows, like, oh, I probably broke it myself. But in his head, it looked like the beetle typewriter killed it. Anyway, since Tom's typewriter is broken, Tom takes Bill's typewriter instead. But Bill, he then grabs the remains of Tom's typewriter and he puts it in a bag, and then he ends up passing out on the beach because he feels like he's not safe in his own home. And then his two friends from earlier show up when he is passed out on the beach, and they kind of help him get himself together, sort of. And he also has all of these papers that he has written, and so they're helping organize the pages that he has written. Obviously, these are Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg inserts, because this is literally what happened, where they showed up and helped him with the papers he had written. But anyway, so they kind of help him organize his papers and encourage him to keep writing before then going on a bus and leaving him. And so Bill is later sleeping in the street when a man from earlier named Kiki sees him, and he helps him, and Kiki takes Bill's typewriter remains to be recast into a new typewriter, and this time it is in the shape of a mugwump head. And while typing, one of the phallic shapes on the head of the mugwump extends and squirts a liquid, which can get you high. And the mugwump also tells him that Dr. Benway is behind everything. And Kiki later takes Bill to come for a drive in the car of a man from earlier named Eve. And this guy seems to be very wealthy, and they go to Eve's home, and Eve is touching Kiki, but Kiki doesn't seem to like it. And then when he goes to a back room, and then when he returns, he is horrified to see Kiki and Eve in a cage. And Eve has morphed into a strange creature that seems to be killing Kiki. And Bill is disgusted, and he returns home to his mugwump typewriter, and he tells the mugwump that he knows it was an ambush, and that he was the one who was supposed to have ended up in that cage, but thankfully he didn't. And so he then goes to find Joan with the cult leader woman, and he sees that they have strung up a bunch of mugwumps, and people are there sucking the liquid from them, getting high from it. And turns out, basically, this housekeeper lady is really Dr. Benway in disguise. And he gets Bill to agree to work for him in another country called Annexia, but Bill says that he will only do this if he can take Joan with him. And he kind of sees saving this Joan as a penance for having killed the other Joan earlier. And so Dr. Benway agrees to this, and at the end of the movie, Bill is driving into Annexia, and they stop him, and they're like, "What's your occupation?" And he tells them he is a writer. And they're like, "What's your proof?" And he shows them he has a pen. And they're like, "We need more proof than that." And so Joan is sleeping in the back, so then he wakes her up and he tells her, "It's time for our William Tell trick." She puts a glass on her head, he aims and shoots and kills her. And the men then, the guards, they're like, "Okay, that proves you're a writer. You can come on into Annexia." And that is how the movie ends. And so obviously there's different types of drugs that are shown in this movie, but I wanted to talk about the drug of writing, which I really liked in the movie, and how early on we see Before his wife dies, we see him with his 2 writer friends, and he is telling them like, oh, I quit writing when I was younger because it's too dangerous. And then we see that when he does begin writing again, it turns into these like hallucinatory experiences that he has. And then when he's typing onto the mugwump typewriter, like it literally squirts out a fluid that can get you high, kind of showing again like how the creative process can be addicting in that sense. And then also there's a part, so after Tom comes and takes Bill's typewriter, Bill then gathers up the remains of Tom's old typewriter in a bag. And when his friends find him, they ask what's in the bag.
What's in the pillowcase, Bill?
These are the remains of my last writing machine. It's been a big problem for me.
Mind if I take a look?
Go ahead.
And when they open up and look in the bag, all they see is a bunch of drug paraphernalia. So in his head, he thought it was his typewriter, but in reality, it was just a bunch of drugs. And then it's also interesting that when he is trying to seduce the second Joan, the way he seduces her is by having her type sexual things into a computer, or not into a computer, into a typewriter. And so again, just showing the power of writing and the power of the artistic creation process. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in real life, Burroughs has said that he would not have begun writing had it not been for Joan's death. And then here in the movie, that's what happens, right? Because after he kills Joan the first time, after that is when he begins to write. And then in the end, he is asked to prove that he is a writer. And so once again, he has to kill her all over again because he can't be a writer if Joan is still alive. And then we also have that phrase, kill your darlings, which is used in writing, but it's also just used in any artistic creative process. They have that phrase. And so here, like, he has to literally kill his darlings in order to prove that he is a writer. And while Cronenberg himself hasn't struggled with drugs, at least not to the extent that Burroughs has, he can relate, I'm sure, to being addicted to the creative artistic writing process. And so I thought, of course, like I said, there's other drugs involved in this movie, but I feel like the writing being an addiction and a drug in its own, it was definitely a big focus here. And I love that that is what Cronenberg chose to hone in on, since that is what he himself could relate to the most, I would think. And then even though this movie, it's not like an old movie, but it's still, 1991, so it's a little older. And so I was happy that despite that, they didn't really tone down the gay aspects of this story. And the line about pretending to be a homosexual is the best cover for an agent. This specific line isn't in the book, but something kind of similar is, because there's a part where the guy is talking about undercover agents and their cover identities and confusing their sexuality while interrogating them. And so you can kind of see where Cronenberg got this from. But in the movie, I just think that's such an interesting line, right? Because it shows Bill's own shame and self-loathing about being gay, because he can say like, oh, I'm just pretending to be gay. I'm not actually queer. I'm just pretending to hide the fact that I'm an agent. And then when he sees Eves with Kiki in the cage, it is the most disgusting part of the movie, and Bill is horrified. And I think that the men were having sex, but Bill interprets it in this gross, monstrous way due to his own internalized homophobia and his own self-loathing, right, for being gay, which again is something that Burroughs writes about in Naked Lunch as well as Queer. But then just to mention a few things in the movie that are in the book Naked Lunch, first of all, mugwumps. Like, basically exactly how they're seen in the movie, we do hear about them in the book, including, their appendage that squirts out liquid that people get addicted to. And if anything, the book kind of delves into that even more. And then we get a scene in the movie when Bill is in the car with Eves and Kiki. He is telling them verbatim, he is telling them something from the book. And it is this story about a man who teaches his butthole how to talk. And this can be seen as like grossly funny, I guess, but when I read it while reading the book, I was just plain grossed out. And yeah, he just says this story verbatim in the movie, which I thought, I know this story probably has deeper meaning. Like, I'm sure it represents someone or something. I don't think we're meant to interpret it as like a literal butthole that is talking. But if you have like a deeper meaning as to why this was included in the movie, you can let me know. But I don't know, maybe it's just this weird, crazy story that's there just to be weird and crazy. But then Interzone and Annexia are also places that are talked about in the book. Dr. Benway is in the book, and he is a disturbing character, and he is one of the ones that will go on about different torture tactics he will use. And the book also has a lot of stories that relate to conspiracies and agents, and it has that noir vibe at times. And we also hear about, again, interrogation tactics and tortures that are used for one reason or another. And the movie definitely captures the paranoia that someone can feel while under the influence. And yeah, the paranoia is something that we feel and hear about throughout the book. And again, there's a quote I shared earlier where when someone is high on drugs, he's talking about how he feels like everything is a coded message when really there's no coded message here. It's just all in his head. And then there's a lot of talk of bugs and beetles and centipedes in both book and movie. But, I said earlier that I was glad I had read Queer because it made me kind of see what Cronenberg was taking from that book for Naked Lunch, the movie. But also now having read and watched Naked Lunch, it makes me appreciate the movie Queer all the more because like Cronenberg's Naked Lunch, Luca Guadagnino, Queer is more of a faithful adaptation than Naked Lunch, but Queer kind of blends things together as well, kind of like Naked Lunch does. And so, yeah, I guess I'm trying to say that Queer and Naked Lunch just complement each other really well. And so I'm glad that I now have read and watched all 4 of these. And then also watching Naked Lunch made me realize that Guadagnino, I think he kind of recreated some of the sets from Naked Lunch for Queer. And so I like that too, because it's almost like he's paying homage to Burroughs, of course, but it's almost like he's paying homage to Cronenberg, too. And then also in Queer, the movie, centipedes are featured so much in the movie, even though in the book they're only talked about once. But now that I have read and watched Naked Lunch, I understand why Queer had so many centipedes because, again, centipedes are talked about so much. And, in literary terms, centipedes can represent anxieties, phobias, both rational and irrational, and nightmares. And I'm not sure if that's what Burroughs was specifically thinking when he included these centipedes, if that's the symbolism he was meaning or if it was just random. I'm not sure, but it is interesting to think about them with that in mind. But a couple things I wanted to mention before moving on to book versus movie, just a couple more movie specific thoughts. So at the start of the movie, Bill is talking to his 2 writer friends and he tells them to exterminate all rational thought. And this being told to us early on, it seems to be them telling the audience to get rid of rational thought as they are about to watch this wild movie. And then also when he sees his wife getting high on bug powder for the first time, she tells him it's a very literary high, it's a very Kafka high because it makes you feel like you're a bug. And then when they are high on the bug powder, because remember, this is used to exterminate bugs. And so when they have it in their system, they can breathe on a bug and it will kill it, which was a weird detail that I liked. And then when the giant beetles, they talk, but their mouth is on their back and it is this disgusting looking hole that I did not like having to look at. And honestly, the first time I saw it, it reminded me of the story from the book, which I mentioned earlier, about the guy teaching his butthole how to talk. And so I was like, is that what they're referencing right now? And then later in the movie, he literally tells us that story. So earlier I was wondering why they included that story and does it have to do with the Beatles? Because that's kind of what it looks like. I don't know. You can let me know your thoughts down below. But then I also wanted to shout out the actor who plays Dr. Benway because he is played by Roy Scheider, who is the main character in Jaws. And Jaws, of course, is just an absolutely perfect movie. So I thought it was cool seeing him in this. And when it comes to book versus movie, so I know this is a very loose adaptation, but I'm just going to go ahead and say the movie wins because I know for a fact I will never read this book again, but I could potentially see myself watching the movie again. And in general, I prefer both book and movie Queer over book and movie Naked Lunch. And maybe it's not fair to even be comparing those, even though both are Burroughs related, because again, the book Naked Lunch and the book Queer are so different. And then the 2 movies are also, they do have some similarities because both of them incorporate aspects of Burroughs' own life. But anyway, basically what I'm saying is that Queer book and movie is one that I would recommend to people, but Naked Lunch, I would have to get to know someone's likes and dislikes pretty well before I recommended this to them. Because to recommend this to someone, you are telling them to subject themselves to something truly disturbing and graphic and disgusting. And I don't say that lightly. You know, like I take in my fair share of weird, upsetting things to some extent. But yeah, this was just on a whole other level. And so I would be hard pressed to ever recommend this to anybody. But if you are watching this video, if what I'm saying about it, if it sounds like it's up your alley, then sure, give it a shot. But you have been warned. And again, the book makes the movie seem tame. So yeah, that should tell you something. And I know I haven't really gotten into specifics as to why this book is so disgusting, but maybe there's other people online that have talked about it and you can find what they have to say, but it's just stuff that I don't even want to talk about it because it was so upsetting. But to anyone who is a fan of this book, I would love for you to share your thoughts down below. And I know, again, this book has more going on than just being about drug addiction and complicated feelings about gay sexuality. Like, I know there's a lot here. So I would love to hear from big fans of this book. Comment down below what it is about it that you like so much. And even though I've been saying how gross this book is, you know, Burroughs is obviously a very effective writer. And, you know, there were certain stories in here that I found very powerful. And yeah, I want to read more by him. But again, I'm not going to read anything that he wrote when he was high on drugs. But thank you everybody for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, comment your thoughts down below. I feel like I was kind of scattered as I was filming this video, but you know, considering the source, maybe it's okay that this video came across that way, since that is exactly how the book is. It's just all over the place. So anyway, yeah. Thank you for watching. I will link to a couple videos at the end that I think you might also like if you were interested in Naked Lunch. So yeah, thank you again, and I will see you next time. Bye.
I'd like you to meet a friend of mine. He specializes in sexual ambivalence.
Sexual ambulance, did you say?